Now I want to provide an overview of the Communist Manifesto and give you some of the highlights of it and try to put some of the ideas together with some ideas from Marx and Engels from other writings. The manifesto begins with an outright boast. It says that communism is like a spectre, and that this spectre or ghost is frightening the powers of, quote, old Europe. Now, what they mean to say is that the people who represent the bourgeoisie, the upper class, the property owners in Europe, are frightened of communism the way a child would be frightened of ghosts. The child thinks that ghosts exist, but he doesn't have any idea what they really are, what they're like. He has no real proof of whether they're really real, but he suspects something, and it's partly the mystery of not knowing what they are that frightens children so. Well, the old powers of Europe are also frightened of communism, but they have no real idea of what it's all about or who it is, and that just heightens the fear. So it is time, they say, for the communists to be open as a movement, instead of being secretive as they have been in the past, being underground because they're afraid of persecution. They have, perhaps he thinks, enough numbers now, enough motivation now, that they need to come out and proclaim their beliefs as a sort of political party, even though they don't want to end up being a political movement in the traditional sense and running for office. They still are trying to proclaim their manifesto, their party platform, so to speak, come out and say who they are, because of course they believe that they will be able to grow in numbers. But it's sort of also a declaration of conflict, a declaration of war of sorts against the bourgeoisie. So then they quickly turn in the first part to what they actually believe as communists. And what they describe here, although they don't use the term here, is something we call dialectical materialism. It is a theory of history, and I discussed this briefly in the last lecture, that sees history as inevitable progress through conflict. The word dialectical refers to that historical process of moving forward through conflict. And materialism, because the conflict is over property. It's instigated by the existence of private property, and it is over property. So over and over again throughout history, you have this conflict about property. And so they say at the very beginning of the first part, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in a constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So this is a very brief one-paragraph statement of the theory of dialectical materialism. And notice the very large stages of history that they make reference to here. Freeman and slave would refer to ancient Greece, and also to a certain extent to ancient Rome as well. Patrician and plebeian definitely to ancient Rome. So the first two references are to the ancient world and the type of class relations they had there. And then lord and serf and guildmaster and journeyman are references to the medieval period, in which the serfs worked the land and were pretty much not slaves, but were pretty much bound to the land by their lords, did not leave their service for life. And the guildmaster and journeyman relationship is the relationship of the tradespeople in the medieval world. There weren't exactly unions. The guilds were not exactly unions, but they were sort of proto-unions. And the guildmaster was in charge of setting the rate of what things would be sold for and how much, therefore, the journeyman would make. So in Marx and Engels' eyes, this was a relationship of dominance and subordination too. So you have these two great previous eras of history, the ancient world, the medieval world, and the different class relationships that they represent. And now we have the modern capitalist world. So though there have been many permutations throughout history, Marx and Engels are basically saying there have been three mega epochs, three mega periods of time in history: the ancient, the medieval, and now the modern capitalist. Now, they have a theory which is not clearly articulated here, but which will help you to understand what they say in the manifesto. It's a theory of where government and things that we usually think of as very important, like religion and culture, where do they come from? How do Marx and Engels express this? How do they explain where these things come from? Well, they have this theory that the type of government that people have, their general culture, including their music and their arts and their stories and so forth, and their religion, in other words, the whole overall society, they call the superstructure. And they say that all of these things are formed by the base being the economy. So Marx and Engels explain the form of government we have, the type of overall culture we have, and even the type of religion that we practice as results of the economy. Okay? So where would Marx and Engels go to look for an explanation for why the government is the way it is, why the members of it are doing what they do? They wouldn't look very much at the actual actions of our politicians. Okay? They would look at who the rich are and the poor are in the society and how the rich are making their money. And on that basis, they would be able to explain the government as in service to the particular agenda of the rich of that time and their particular, quote, mode of production. Now, it's fairly easy for us to imagine that you could explain at least partly the way the government operates on the basis of whether who the rich are and what they're doing to make their money. It may be a little bit harder for us to imagine that our overall culture, and especially our religion, is conditioned by primarily class structure and the interests of the rich. And indeed, Marx and Engels are not saying that the rich get together in a sort of club and decide what the religion will be or what types of things will be valued in the culture, but they do believe that the powerful in the society tend to develop ideas that serve their purposes, sometimes very unconsciously, but still, because people are what they are, self-interested creatures, at least at this point in time, they will develop ideas that are convenient for them. And we'll explore this a little bit more in a bit. But remember, for now, the base of the society is its material conditions. Who owns what, and the economic classes that form in the society. So what the Marxist analyst would do to explain a society is to look for what and how things are produced and who is made rich as a result of that production. And then they would then explain the government, the culture, and the religion on that basis. And they would say that all of these institutions, the government, the culture, the religion, enforce the economic status quo and justify class oppression. Now, to get back to an explanation of religion in particular, Marx and Engels thought that Judaism and Christianity, or Judeo-Christian religion, was particularly good at justifying class oppression, and that is maybe one of the main reasons that it had such staying power. How did it justify this? Well, the message that Judeo-Christianity sent people according to Marx and Engels, is that they should be passive and that they should accept their situation, that perhaps the people who are in charge of them are there because God ordained them to be there, but even if that isn't true, that God is the final judge, that there is a heaven that exists for those who are righteous, and there is a hell for those who are not righteous, and God will sort people out in the next life, so that it is not for us to judge in this life. We should simply meekly accept our situation and be obedient to God. Well, they say, oh, what a good ideology, so to speak, for the ruling classes to perpetuate, because it encourages the working classes to simply accept their domination without fighting back. So, in other words, the religion in particular, but also the culture, that is its values, the values that it promotes, divert people's attention from their oppressors and keep them from fighting back. Now keep this in mind when you think about how Marx and Engels might view our government today. This will give you a pretty clear notion of what this theory of the base and superstructure is all about. Would they look at the procedures that we have in our democratic society, such as voting, and say, this is a voting people, this is a people who chooses their representatives, it's a democracy, and that's good? No, they wouldn't say that. They didn't admire democracy because they thought of democracy as an invention of the bourgeoisie, an invention of the rich elite. And they look through it, they say, sort of cutting through the surface, they say, who's really in charge of a democratic society? Who are the people that the masses elect? On what basis do they elect them? Well, they would say wealth has a lot to do with it. It has a lot to do with who is put forward as a candidate, if they are either rich themselves or can draw the money from the rich to make their campaign possible, so that the people don't really have the choice that they think they have in a democratic society. Instead, they're just choosing between two fairly similar bourgeois candidates, both of whom are going to perpetuate the status quo, basically. Whether they're a Republican or a Democrat is a very minor difference in the mind of a Marxist. Whether one wants to make government a little bigger or a little less big is really irrelevant if both parties basically agree that the capitalist system is good and nobody wants to take too much property away from the rich, because that would end the system. So that's how a Marxist would view our government, and that's about the best example of the theory of base and superstructure that I can give. It's a pretty skeptical view of government, a pretty skeptical view in particular of democracy, but this is why Marxists turn around and say that they don't support the democratic system. Now, today's Marxists, many of them do, but they're different than they used to be. Back in Marx and Engels' time, a Marxist was suspicious that democracy would always be abused by capitalist elites, and so the only way to really rule in the interests of the masses was to rule with a sort of popular dictatorship. And this is exactly what, say, Lenin and Mao in China did. They eliminated democracy in the sense of voting, and they said that they did this in the favor of the masses so that they could rule without the interference of elites. Okay, so the current situation at Marx's time was, according to Marx and Engels, that modern bourgeois society, which was a liberal society, classically liberal, it was beginning to be highly industrialized, was boiling with class conflict. That it was this modern liberal society at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution where we're going to see the final conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The modern Industrial Revolution society is creating such misery, such anger, such perturbation in the people's minds that there will be a terrible conflict as a result. Now, sometimes Marx and Engels sound like they're really bemoaning this. This is a terrible situation. But for the most part, Marx and Engels are very hopeful here. In fact, this is very necessary progress. It has to be this way. It has to be this bad in order for there to be that ultimate revolution which will usher in a much different society. Now, we have to think about what they thought the economic conditions of early industrial capitalism were doing compared to feudalism, because they always look at the current historical situation in light of previous epochs of history. Now, they say that compared to the feudal situation, capitalism simplifies class conflict. Now, they say in feudalism, there were many different targets for the serfs to finger, to say it was their fault. If the serfs ever got too miserable and they began to complain, they had plenty of different people to complain against. They had their lord. They had the prince or the king. They had the church. They had all these different layers of authority in the feudal situation. And the government, the church, their immediate superiors. So it was hard for them to know who the enemy was, and also, of course, they had this very strong Christian message that they should not revolt against their superiors and just accept their fate. Now compare that, they say, with the capitalist situation. The workers, according to Marx and Engels, now will see that there are just two classes. They're going to be able to see that the government is the handmaid of the rich, because it's so painfully obvious that the government is not on their side because they're so miserable. So they will see that it is them versus the rich. And they won't be able, he says, to really cling to the church, to cling to religion, because religion and the church are not doing very much to help them either. And they're so miserable that it becomes hard for people to cling to the ideals. Okay? Again, in places Marx and Engels sound a little bit sad about this, but they're really not. They don't want people to cling to the ideals of religion or the ideal of obeying your superiors. They want people to strip themselves of those. So they believe that in capitalism, all of the veils that people have deluded themselves with in the past are going to be stripped away, and there will be clearly two camps, the few who are the bourgeoisie and the many who are the workers or the proletariat. And they say that in capitalism, at this point, there is great alienation. Now, this is a word that is not used in the manifesto, but it is described in the manifesto. The misery of the working class in capitalism is mainly produced by alienation. Now, what is alienation? Well, one thing that they point out here is that the workers in this situation own nothing but their own bodies. They own nothing but the work that their bodies can do, and so their worth is tied pretty much to whether they can work or not and how much they can work. And they begin to see their bodies and thus themselves as commodities, things to be bought and sold, so that we are not human beings, we are products in that type of capitalist system. And this makes people feel unnatural or alienated, because Marx and Engels, of course, believe that people are not products, that people are not commodities, and that their labor shouldn't be treated simply as a commodity. So they believe that there will be and is a sort of psychological pain or alienation that comes when you treat people like commodities. You also have the obvious fact at that time that people were paid very, very, very little for the work that they had to give. They were given enough money, say Marx and Engels, to come back the next day, basically. Enough money to just barely keep them alive so that they could work again. They weren't paid enough money to be able to save and to accumulate any other property. As soon as they got it, they had to pay some other bourgeois for rent, for groceries, for fuel, and so forth, and it was all gone. And so it was like an endless treadmill for the workers. Now, when they were at work, they're further alienated by the mode of production, by the type of work that they do. They're treated, he says, like cogs in a big machine in the factory. They are put in a particular station and they do a repetitive task for hours and hours and hours of the day. They are never asked what they want to do or whether they could do this a different way and do it better. They're not going to be giving any input. They just stand there and do their job until they can't do it anymore. Well, this is certainly like treating people like a part of a machine. So the factory conditions are very impersonal as well as very dangerous. Now, all of this means that people cannot take any pride or express any individuality in their work whatsoever. Now, you might think that Marx and Engels want to give up factory production because of this quality, but they don't. Actually, they believe communism has to rely on factory production and that this is one of the benefits that capitalism gives us. But they would change the way factory labor is done so that people do it creatively, do it with their input, do it as a team, switch jobs, switch tasks, and are listened to in the process instead of just being treated like a commodity. Now, as it is now, they have absolutely no ownership over what they produce. So they're told what to produce and how to do it. They don't get to have any input on what the factory is making or how. And that makes a big difference, according to Marx and Engels, in how they feel about their job. There is no joy in these jobs whatsoever. It is sheer, almost slavery, is how they depict it. Again, alienation happens there. It happens from themselves, alienation from their own being because they cannot see themselves, they cannot explore themselves at all in the work that they do, alienation from the profits, which all go to the capitalists. And finally, another aspect of capitalist alienation is alienation from their fellow workers. Now, this is an issue that's still a problem for Marxists and people who lean in this direction today, even though the capitalist situation is much different in some respects because people are not universally poor. But still, we tend to see each other in the workplace as competitors, and this was certainly the case in Marx and Engels' day. Literally, if you couldn't work well enough, you were simply fired the next day. If you were injured, you were fired. If somebody came along who was better than you, you were fired. So, of course, human beings in that situation will see each other as very serious threats and do whatever they can to stop that threat from taking their livelihood away from them. Again, that is a great alienation, according to Marx and Engels, viewing your fellow human beings as competitors when we really naturally would probably see them as helpers, as Marx and Engels view us as social beings, as members of a society. So, the social alienation of capitalism then has done away with all of the warm, fuzzy social ties that people used to think that they had between themselves and even ties to their supposedly natural superiors. They know that there is nothing superior about the capitalist than that he has more money than they do. They know, or think they know, that their fellow man is nothing but a source of threat. This is a world which is truly very painful to endure if you can imagine living as they depict a worker living in those times. You can also imagine why people would get angry enough to revolt and to do drastic things. Marx and Engels say that small business will be gobbled up by bigger businesses, and that those big businesses will get bigger and bigger until there are very few left. You will have huge monopolies, and these monopolies will run the economy. Now, Marx and Engels, again, they sound mournful at times, and here's a spot where they sound mournful about the loss of the illusions of society. They say, the bourgeoisie, wherever it has gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, and ideal relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in the place of numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms, it has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, brutal exploitation. Truly, capitalism has done an incredible amount of damage to society. And even, they say, it has torn the family asunder. The family itself has broken up because of this system. The family is now about money relations. And this is according also to the bourgeois and the proletarian family. Both types of families are now about money. The bourgeois family produces children with the idea of those children perpetuating the business. The wife in the bourgeois family is primarily seen as a producer of children. The family is together because a man and woman got together for property reasons, in order to keep money together, not because of love. And then if we look at the proletarian family, we see a family that might have first gotten together through love, but which doesn't have any time to express that love and is beaten down by the system. The wife must go out and work. She cannot make a home for the family. She goes out and works as long hours as her husband does. And the children, they're not going off to school. They can't afford it. As soon as they reach the age of maybe 7, they're doing something to make money for the family too. And Marx and Engels even tell us in the worst case scenario, they and their mother may end up prostituting themselves, selling their own bodies in order to bring money into the family. In this situation, there is no real family. There is just a group of people that are working together to survive, but have no time to actually experience family life. So again, a very, very dismal situation is depicted here. Well, it's a vicious, vicious situation. As a result of the competition amongst businesses, they say crises of overproduction will occur, which means that, as businesses try to become more and more efficient, they will replace workers with machines. They will pay workers as little as humanly possible. They'll throw a lot of people out of work. And when they gobble up businesses, more people will be out of work. And pretty soon factories will be producing things that few people can buy. And that will put more businesses out of work. Marx and Engels really thought that capitalism was an irrational system. Now, we may think that nowadays it seems as though it's pretty rational. It works fairly well. But I suppose back in their days, we can imagine, we can understand how this might seem very irrational. You have this wonderful system for producing items that everybody can use. But the competition amongst businesses throws people out of work so that they can't afford the items, which then throws businesses out of business because there's nobody to sell to, or they have to try to find overseas markets to sell their products to, etc. They say that because of these cycles of overproduction, huge classes of people, huge groups, I should say, of people will be created who are unemployed or underemployed and feel as though they have nothing to lose. And truly, people do get to the point at certain times when they have nothing to lose and when they are so angry that they just simply will rise up and risk their lives. Marx and Engels thought that that would happen in Europe, in places like England and Germany and France, and it did not, because capitalism actually changed and moderated and developed further, and the government also developed further in the direction of welfare. And so it didn't happen there. As you know, it happened in places like agricultural Russia and China and places like that that had an agricultural economy instead of a capitalist economy. But anyway, what they say here is that alienation will cause what they call class consciousness to emerge. The proletariat will become painfully and completely aware of its exploitation. And when it becomes completely aware of its exploitation, it will become once and for all capable of seizing all the property from the bourgeoisie. It will see that the only way out is to seize its property. This is not so much a war against the bourgeoisie as individuals, although obviously that's what it turned into and what it is in practice, but intellectually speaking, it's a war against that property. It's a war against the system that says that people can have the property. So the first thing that people would want to do is to seize the means of production. So they will not destroy the capitalist means of production. As I said, they can be very useful if used well, but they will seize them and begin to use them for communist purposes, for the people. Imagine the power that these people, Marx and Engels and other people like them, saw in factory production. This miraculous new way of producing mass quantities of items that people need at a reasonable cost. Well, of course they thought, gosh, what could be done with this if we could use it rationally, if we could plan so that we made what people really need and we didn't make it cost a lot. In fact, eventually they want it to cost nothing, for there to be no money in society, but just people working in a planned economy to produce what everybody needs. Imagine what this type of technology could do. So with class consciousness, the political scales will fall from people's eyes, and they will see through the bourgeois representative state. They will see through the democracy that they have but don't really have, because most of them can't vote anyway, and those who can vote, who have enough property to vote, aren't really given a choice. They will see through all that. They will see that the only way to really change the situation is to once and for all get rid of property. And they will do this through a revolution. And the manifesto says that they may have to make despotic inroads. They may have to make, in other words, violent inroads on that property. They may have to kill people to take away their property. They know that the revolution will be violent and will include bloodshed. And this is something that many other socialists, as you'll see when you read the third part, didn't believe was necessary. A major difference between Marx and Engels and the communists that they represent and other socialists and communist theorists out there was that they didn't believe that you could ever get to communism through argument, through philosophy, through the agreement of enlightened elites, or anything like that. They believed that it just had to be forced on these few people who were standing in the way. They believed that this was total realism, and in the long run, well worth it. And I suppose they thought, since they were in the situation themselves, that bourgeoisie who had any sense would join their side at a certain point instead of being destroyed and become communists themselves.